Okay, everybody, I'm going to get started. It's so nice to see you with us tonight. We always offer these programs as both a Zoom webinar and a live stream on Facebook. So hopefully we pick up a little bit more audience there, and then the recording is put on our YouTube page once we edit it. So in a couple of weeks, we'll have that posted on YouTube as well. I'm Sarah Hall. I'm the director of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, and tonight we're going to focus on the exhibition Exploring Jonathan Street, History, Art, Imagination, which is in its final couple of weeks at the museum. So if you haven't seen it, please do come in before September 11th when it closes. It's a really special exhibition, and the artifacts and the story that it tells are a universal story, but I think they mean more to the people who know this neighborhood than they do to others. So do come in and experience it while we have it together. Tonight's Let's Talk Art has been sponsored by Ashley and Dean Notobartello. Tonight, Daniel and I are joined by two incredibly active community members, Reggie Turner and Tereance Moore of the Western Maryland Community Development Corporation, and also a lot of activities in the community, too numerous to list, but they have been key players in the story of the Jonathan Street cabin and indispensable resources for us as we have embarked on trying to shine the spotlight on this story. A lot of people have heard me say, we are not authorities here, we are the vehicle. We are trying to tell the story, we're trying to share the story, we're trying to be part of a big snowball rolling down a hill, bringing more and more attention to histories that have been marginalized over generations. So I'm going to stop talking now because I know Reggie has limited time with us, and let's have Daniel bring up our PowerPoint and we'll get right to our discussion.
Thanks, Sarah. Here we go. The Jonathan Street exhibition is on through September 11th, and we certainly encourage you to come see it if you are able to. So the whole basis for the exhibition starts with the cabin at 417 North Jonathan Street. And Reggie, we'd love to hear your insights and your story about how this came to be.
Sure. Well, thank you both for having us tonight. Hopefully Terrence will be able to join us. I know that he was with the Greater Hagerstown Committee on a visit to another city tonight. And I am en route to watch my youngest daughter play volleyball. So I am multitasking as well. But in regards to my involvement with this project, in 2017, Governor Hogan appointed me to the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And when Governor Hogan did so, I was a little perplexed because many of the members of that commission are historians, genealogists, archivists, and various other humanities. And I felt like I stuck out like a sore thumb because I'm a 20+ year financial advisor by trade. But in reaching out to Governor Hogan and his staff, they explained that my financial perspective and my love for history could lend itself to the organization. And in all honesty, I really did not know what my term of service would look like since this area was new to me other than my passion for history. But one of the community members, Ron Lytle, introduced me to a preservation study that the city of Hagerstown had completed in 2002. And this preservation study of the Jonathan Street community noted many of its historic assets and the different structures that were vulnerable within the community and some recommendations of what should be done. And when I first was able to see this document in 2018, I was flabbergasted to see that none of the recommendations had been adequately fulfilled. And then that leads us to the cabin. The cabin was one of the historic structures that was notated in this document, but no one really knew how historic this log cabin was. So after the police officer hit it, some time had went by, and then at some point in 2018, Councilwoman Takesha Martinez reached out to me, letting me know that home was scheduled to be demolished. And from there, we jumped into action and asked the community to advocate for the city to postpone demolishing this property. And we were successful in that campaign. And then subsequently, the city invited me to City Hall to speak about this property and other historic structures in the community. During that process, we developed an organization. We developed a relationship with the statewide preservation organization, and through that relationship, that's when things started to really take off. From there, Tereance and I needed to develop a relationship with the homeowner and his advocates, because Mr. Richard O. Davis, that lived in the home, is in his 90s, and he had caregivers that were taking care of his day-to-day needs and also his financial needs. But through the relationship that we built with him and his caregivers, we were able to convince him that we would be able to honor him and his home, but also preserve it. So we were able to kind of move forward. And a big key piece was when our former Senator, Andrew Serafini, at the end of the last session that he was in the State House, he was able to get us $250,000 in funding for this project. And from there, Preservation Maryland jumped into action, bringing a plethora of resources from around the state, including the State Highway Administration and Dr. Julie Shablisky and her archaeological team. And from there, this little unassuming cabin in the Johnson Street community became a national story. During this time, we had media from all over the state that came. There was Maryland Public Television doing a mini documentary, and the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, and many other organizations covering this archaeological dig and what we were uncovering within the community. The one thing that I'll say from my vantage point, being a financial advisor, I often look at things from the financial impacts to community. And I believe one of the things that Tereance and I truly contribute to community is looking at things through the lens of historic preservation, but also economic growth and development. When you look at the Jonathan Street community, the home ownership within that community is substantially less than the city of Hagerstown. The city of Hagerstown has roughly about a 40% home ownership rate, and the Johnson Street community has roughly about a 14% ownership rate. And then one of the other factors that caught our attention in regards to seeking to save this cabin is the wealth gap. And that is something that is near and dear to my heart as a financial white families and Black families. And one of the things that I have been committed to do in my community service is helping to address the wealth gap in our community. So this process really blossomed from there. Obviously, you can see from the pictures that have been scrolled through that the cabin project has been completed. There has been a ribbon cutting for that. The cabin is now on the market. And some of the amazing things that we found out about the cabin was that the logs from this cabin were felled in the winter of 1739. And the only structures that were in Hagerstown at that time were the cabins of the founder of Hagerstown, Jonathan Hager. And one of the unique things that we find when we start looking at African-American ownership of this cabin, which started towards the later part of the 1800s, is the first African-American owner of this cabin was a woman named Annie Bentley. And for someone like me that has 3 daughters, being able to talk about wealth building and home ownership in regards from a woman's perspective was really exciting for me to be able to share with my own children. So that is kind of the crux of the start of this project. And from our standpoint in regards to this work, we have looked at this work not just as a one-off project, but the opportunity to spark economic development in a part of the city of Hagerstown that's been left behind. And that's been the exciting part. One of the things that this project has spurred is roughly about $2 million investment for the community. And there's some other things that we've been working on behind the scenes to address some of the poverty and also lack of home ownership in the community. So I'm excited in regards to kind of where this can go from here.
That's great. I'll just interject that I came to Hagerstown in July 2020, and I think that was right about when the archaeological excavating was beginning. And I read about it in the paper, and I thought, well, this is so fascinating. It's such a compelling story. You know, Reggie and Tereance have heard this before, but it reminded me of a 6th grade social studies unit we did studying a household in ancient Greece, where we were given, you know, fake artifacts, and we had to try and interpret what the lifestyles of the people were like and who might have owned them. And I thought, this is it. This is happening right here. This wonderful puzzle that sparks our intellectual curiosity and our imaginations equally, which is why I started thinking that, you know, it needed to be an exhibition. We needed to get these artifacts from storage in the state archaeological repository and bring them here, give people an opportunity to see them. Try to take the huge tome that was the archaeological report, as well as some of the other, you know, Lynn Bowman's 10 Weeks on Jonathan Street and some of the other research that had been done, and try and translate it into something relatively accessible and understandable. I mean, there's a lot. If you go in the exhibition, it's a lot of information. There's a timeline of the cabin's history interwoven with significant local Black history. We tried to match the artifacts up when possible with segments of the timeline that might indicate who owned them. It's a lot of information that we've tried to de-densify, but I just think it's a great story, and it comes down to this whole thing of, you know, what do we save? What gets saved? What's important to us? And I know that you guys had a big disappointment with another historic structure that did not get saved. So that makes this cabin even more symbolic, I think. But what a jackpot it was, though, to find how old the timbers were and to find the story behind it.
Absolutely. If we did not lose 335 North Jonathan Street, we probably would not have had the opportunity to save this property.
Mm-hmm. So Tereance, it's so good to see you with us. Maybe just tell us a little bit about what the cabin means to you, and then we can move further on in the discussion.
Good evening. Thank you. Reggie hit upon, you know, a lot of the key points, but individually, I'm originally from New York City. I came out here in 2004. I worked in finance for over 20 years. And even in this community, it was a bedroom community to me. I commuted to and from work, and I really didn't have a connection or relationship into the community. And this little cabin has completely changed that to me, even personally, to the legacy and understanding of African-American history, American history in general, and how the African-American business owner played a major part in the community. And I think that was something that really came out of this, a lot of the learning and opportunities to learn throughout this process, learning more about the Reconstruction period, and, you know, what happened immediate after slavery, when communities like the historic Jonathan Street community built churches, have had their own YMCA, built their own schools, was flooded with number of businesses up and down the streets in that community. Growing up, we never learned, but we always heard of in my community or Black Wall Street. It was something to aspire to. It was something that was in our past and something that once existed. And to actually work and be a part of one of those communities was just enlightening and a blessing in disguise. I don't believe there was anything in coincidence. And I believe the loss of one property was intentional to direct us and put us in position for this property. And because of that, we've learned so much. We've opened so many eyes. We've brought money into the community. We've helped set up and establish and support business owners. So we're still advocating for bringing businesses back into the community. It selfishly has been just a learning experience for myself, but and just to be a part of this legacy and attach a small part of mine to the legacy that has been established in this community for decades, it's just amazing. I never thought a transplant from New York City would be coming here and be some way connected to the founder of the community who also transplanted here in Hagerstown, and being the namesake and having that connection. There's so many parallels, there's so many learnings. I still haven't personally fully had enough time to kind of reflect on the experience because things have happened so quickly. Reggie and I, we sit and we have conversations constantly in awe of, you know, the opportunities that have been presented through this initiative, through this log cabin, working with the Museum of Fine Arts. It's just been an amazing opportunity as well. And I served on the advisory committee, so I've always had a passion for the work and that goes into that museum, and always thought it was a gem. But even to see this connection and be a part of tying it together and seeing community members walk through the halls of the Museum of Fine Arts and say, I've lived in this community my entire life, 60 and 70 years in the community, and I've never stepped foot in this museum.
Yeah, I love that picture of Mr. Davis with mural. And when he found his name on the wall, it said, how did this get here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, the opening is one of probably going to be one of my most treasured museum memories. It was just such a wonderful night. So much celebrating together happening that night. So in terms of the artifacts in the exhibition, what do you think, people find the most interesting or compelling to look at? Although people are loving the maps and the histories, for sure.
I had some great conversation around the oil lamp. My family is originally from Alabama. And even in my mother home today in New York City, 2 generations later, those oil lamps still sit in a lot of our homes. They're still tied to the memory of an oil lamp. And, especially because they even have reference in a biblical sense of the oil and the alabaster, things like that. So I think it was great to hear those conversations of everybody walking over that spoke about that lamp, talking about how someone they're either in their own home or their grandmother's home or their parents' home or great-grandmother's home had one of those lamps. So just to have that connection, just historically.
Yeah. Well, when I used it, we just closed an exhibition called Allure of the Near East, and I was telling a lot of people that, the shows were more similar than different because they were about how people live their everyday lives. And there was an oil lamp in that exhibition as well, that I, sort of called out and compared to the fragments of oil lamps and candlesticks that we had in the Jonathan Street exhibition. Yeah. So Daniel's been giving us a major collage of images here. Did you have a linear narrative you wanted to follow, Daniel?
No, it's fine if we jump around. It makes it part of the fun of the
I know we're going to
discussion.
lose Reggie, so I would like to hear, before he goes off and cheerleads for his daughter, kind of, what's next? We're going to close this exhibition and pack everything up, and the cabin is on the market. What other stories do we need to sort of shine a spotlight on? What else is happening in the community that we all should know about?
you know, one of the things that we have learned through this process is that in the same period of time that Annie Bentley purchased the cabin was the same period of time that the community center was being built as a Black school. And we have looked at the community center as a nucleus of that community for resources, from its transition from Black school to YMCA to now community center. And as I was speaking of, you know, this process has generated close to $2 million for rehabilitation of this community center. The front of the community center was built in 1888, and the back portion was built in 1924, and it is in dire straits of tender loving care, but also being modernized for the community in regards to their needs of today. So we're in the process of engaging with the community center in regards to getting these funds deployed to rebuild the community center, revitalize that space. Also in regards to the swimming pool, which is a large connection to everyone in the community. And, you know, as we re-envision that space, I would love for, whether it's artifacts, art, some different ideas from folks that are more well-versed in regards to what would make sense to find its way into that space as we revitalize that. So Sarah, I'm putting my pitch in.
Okay.
Dreaming that forward.
No, that's a great idea. And of course, there's the future site of the Dolman Museum of African American History, which we're all really excited about as well. I will tell you, the day of the opening, you had arranged for Senator Benson to come in and be interviewed for the documentary film that's the House on Jonathan Street that's supposed to be released in February. And she told the story that was the most powerful to me that she told was about the kids going to school and how close they were to their teachers and how everybody knew each other, and how when the children would go to school, their teachers would hug them and say, "We missed you," which almost made me cry because I had a kid who didn't like school. And I thought, geez, maybe if my son had had this experience, he wouldn't have had stomach aches in the morning. But you know, those stories, and Lola Mosby, who's one of our Singer Society volunteers and wrote a lovely personal memoir that we have on our memory board that's part of the exhibition, really bring to life the sense of community, the shared purpose and connections between people in just such a vivid way. Yeah, there's Lola posting her story and sharing it with one of our staff members, and you can see our community bulletin board there. But yeah, just wonderful, vivid connections to people in their lives.
Definitely, Sarah. And to add to that, I remember when we first opened the exhibition, we only had maybe one or two memories on the bulletin board, and look at how it's grown. And
we've cleared it a couple times. A lot. Sometimes it's kids drawing pictures, but we have cleared it into binders, and a lot of people remembering particular shops that they liked to go to, you know, walking to church, walking to school. It's been a wonderful show, I think, multi-generationally too, seeing people coming in with parents and grandparents and young children and sharing this story is really terrific. I often tell the story that, you know, so much of the time what you see in museums, you know, is the stuff that got saved, which usually was, you know, the clothing of wealthy people who could buy new clothing, and they weren't cutting their clothing down. It wasn't getting worn out. It wasn't getting remade into pillows or quilts. You know, so it's just been such a lopsided story in many museums and in the types of things they collect and talk about. So it has been really a pleasure to, you know, have a case with marbles in it, children's marbles, and think about the hands that played with them. which Daniel, I think, is finding now. So why don't you take us into the exhibition a little bit, Daniel? And Reggie and Tereance, we lost Reggie. Tereance, you should talk about, anything that moves you as well.
Yes,
There are the children's toys, yeah.
exactly. As Sarah was saying, we have some of the marbles here that are on view in the exhibition and that were found. We're also going to talk about some objects that were used perhaps for personal or religious purposes in our discussion. Many shards of pottery, and the total number of objects excavated by the team was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,200. And in the exhibition, we were able to select 90 of those, some 2,000 pieces, in order to create a representation of the broad spectrum. But just think about all of that was found on the grounds of the cabinet. It's just amazing. And the thing about archaeology that's so fascinating is you reconstruct stories to the best of your ability based upon the fragments of history. So you find a foot, for example, that came from a doll. This was actually loaned from one of our staff members, Sarah Wolf, who works as a registrar and exhibitions coordinator. And she has one of these period dolls in her collection. So we brought in some of those pieces. Tereance before mentioned the lamp. The lamp also is brought in from Sarah's collection, Sarah Wolf's, to show, okay, this is just a piece of what was a larger object to provide context.
Yeah, look at that little foot.
Yeah, and I love the marbles as well, because there's so many moments in our personal history that we don't realize how far they go back. And I grew up and I remember my father teaching me how to play with marbles, and it was a social game. It was in the streets and drawing a circle, and that just a generation after me, kids don't play marbles anymore. All right. And what happens 2 generations from now, and how just something as a toy really ties us back to community and our social interactions as well.
Yeah. Tereance, you said drawing the circle, which of course is a wonderful metaphor, and that leads me to Graf's painting, because the marbles and the drawing the circle are a part of the symbology so we conscious of the fact that we are an art museum and that this is primarily a show about history. I really wanted us to include a contemporary art component because of the way this our histories spark our imaginations. And so we asked Keelan Gant, who goes by the name Graf Dummy in his art career, to create an artwork for us. And you can see him in his studio talking to us about his process. But that draw the circle is a big part of it. You can see he's got the sort of arena for playing marbles is the eye of the one figure. And I think people have really enjoyed looking at this painting and pulling apart the symbols and the narrative. For me, I think the most moving part is the flowers, which have the very racially stereotyped faces, which he says are references not only to history, but also to contemporary artists who work with that history, but they are growing from the soil and singing the songs. And I just love that idea of the history of the site bearing fruit, bringing up seeds and new growth. So this was a really fun part of the whole project for us, working with Keelan on this.
Yeah, and I love the sky. And you can see through the changing of time, and and even with the night sky really stands out. And I know that I've seen so many movies and studied how important the stars for navigating through time and navigating to freedom was so important, especially a community like this. And no matter where we are in the world, we're all looking up into the same sky, and that kind of unity that can be pulled together through that vision and just the different clouds. It's just looking at this painting, every time I see it, I get something else out of it.
That's great. I love that. Forgive me for living in downtown Hagerstown. I support downtown Hagerstown. Loud here. Yeah, wonderful references. I mean, our idea here too was, hopefully people spend time looking at the artifacts and understanding all these fragments of history and how they come together. And of course, he's remixed them in this different way. So you can have fun finding the actual references to the show, as well as, seeing the way he's put them together and the ideas that he's, made manifest. I love the fact that by the fence line, the artifacts actually have their inventory numbers on them, because he went with us down to the archaeological repository at the state when we had everything in plastic bags, and we were looking through, getting an idea of the kinds of things we might borrow. And so clearly the way things are documented and codified in a museum collection was made an impression on him too. It was a great experience.
Yeah, it's interesting how, artifacts today are, how much science is involved in preserving and holding these artifacts. And, as growing up, it was a shoebox or a tin box in an attic or in a closet that really held the history. And in this case, it was the soil that preserved a lot of the history as well.
Mm-hmm. It was.
Yes, and one other thing that I wanted to, just a few other things that I also find very interesting about the painting are, and I was looking at this today, that Keelan chose to represent the cabin pre-restoration with those timbers from 1739-40 exposed before the repairs and renovations. And then notice how there's steam coming out of the kitchen, and that's a reference to the cooking that was done in that cabin, and many of the faunal remains, that is of animals, bones that were buried in the backyard, from which the archaeologists, in terms of the science that Tereance was mentioning, were able to deduce that the residents, what kinds of cuts of meat they were eating.
Well, can you can you enlarge it any more to see the little pie that's sitting there cooling? Which is a homey touch. Yeah, it's a homey touch that he also said came from watching a lot of cartoons as a kid, where the pie that's set out to cool is always stolen, but it always means home, right? And comfort and someone in the kitchen.
Yes, and then the importance of the Hoyt's cologne bottle and a horseshoe, as Sarah was mentioning before, inventory numbers of each object, and then the cat heel bone. And let me pull up that slide and we can discuss that a little bit more. Let me just find it.
Yeah, I see Reggie just jumped back on. So I was gonna steal one of his lovely tidbits that he loves to talk about. Daniel, you kind of alluded to it about the cuts of meat that was actually used during that time. So Turner.
Well, the fascinating thing that we learned is that the African Americans that began to inhabit the cabin in the late 1800s ate higher on the hog than the German immigrants. And what that spoke to is what we had originally thought, that during Reconstruction, as African Americans were becoming the predominant members in this community, they were building wealth. They were building schools, they were building churches, they were building businesses. And the archaeological dig confirmed what we had thought in regards to the wealth that was being built in the community, which we thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it in one way, it's like, of course, the original immigrants weren't eating well, but it is the fact that you're seeing that building prosperity is really, really quite fascinating, because it is it helps you envision the way the city developed as well, from being more densely populated, to having, how far away was the butcher? Maybe not very far away, right?
And it also takes away the stigma all the time of everything in Black history was about poverty and struggle. There was an opportunity, especially in Reconstruction, when Black Blacks owned businesses, and we started churches, and we served even in a political as elected officials. So it gives back that pride of your history as well, of a community as a whole that was thriving versus the one or two individuals that are always plucked out of history as successful as if it was an anomaly, to know there was whole communities that were thriving and productive at one time, as well as business.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's a very good point. And of course, we know something about some of the businesses and talk about them in our timeline as well as in some of the graphics in the exhibition.
Yes, as Terrence was discussing just now, Jacob Wheaton, as we showed on the timeline here in 1870, 1875, he became an early African-American member of the Maryland State Republican Committees. And in April, he joined a man named John A. Wagoner and W.R.G. Gaskins to be appointed to the Republican State Central Committee. So that was a great achievement for Mr. Wheaton. And he passes that kind of interest in participating in the political process down to his son, Frank Wheaton, who rises to become a very important attorney and one of the first African Americans to be admitted to the Maryland bar in 1893. And then you have in the 1890s, Walter Harmon, who originally came from Virginia, but resettled in Hagerstown and becomes one of the wealthiest residents in the Jonathan Street community in opening his Harmon's Hotel. Unfortunately, he didn't live as long as one might have hoped, and he passed the business on to his widow, Florence. So Mr. Harmon is part of this great prosperity and the story of the growth of these businesses during Reconstruction and beyond. So those are some of these important individuals. And then, of course, we have very famously in 1879, Frederick Douglass, who comes to Hagerstown and delivers an important lecture at the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church that really moves the audience. And he talked about a number of issues, about being a self-made man, of course, having escaped slavery from Maryland's Eastern Shore. And in the words of a local reporter in the Torchlight paper at the time, and I quote, he said that the lecture was fresh, sparkling, witty, logical, and awakening, and that he regaled the audience with an intellectual treat seldom, equally, and rarely or never surpassed. So Douglass left quite the impression on the his attendees, and it's really fascinating that Douglass came to Hagerstown. Of course, it was Maryland connections, but it's still not known for certain how his speaking engagement was secured, but it was certainly through some of the people he knew in Hagerstown, perhaps Louis McComas, a white politician at the time. So the case of Douglass is one example that connects to the broader history of America, but occurring here in Hagerstown.
Daniel, one of the things that we did find out through the research of Professor Lynn Bowman and others is that when Frederick Douglass did visit Hagerstown in 1879, he was actually raising money for Bethel Church. They had accrued some debt, and his speech was to help them pay that debt off. And the other interesting thing that we learned through the Afro-American newspaper, which has been in existence for over 200 years, is that Frederick Douglass was led into town by the Moxley Band. And the tie to all of that is the Moxley Band practiced out of 335 North Johnson Street, the home that we lost. So that's kind of a connection between, the two events.
So that's interesting because we did have one question come up in the Q&A, which was about relations to the AME Church. So we've touched on that a little bit. And there was a question, does the cemetery relate to this cottage? Is it close by? I know that most of the cemeteries that I've been hearing people talk about restoration and research on locally are not close by, but there could be another cemetery that I'm unaware of that has connections to more close connections. I don't know.
Well, the cemetery that was on the property of Bethel Church, it was common belief that the remains were removed at some point to Rose Hill Cemetery. But through the research of historians, they believe that many of the remains were not moved and that the majority of the cemetery is actually covered by the housing development that was brought in, Bethel Gardens. However, when Dr. Julie Shablisky was here for the archaeological dig, I took her over to the church and just for her to see the area and talk about the possibilities of ground penetrating radar and some different things there. And what she felt from some of the images that she saw and actually walking the property, that there's probably still a portion of the old cemetery that is not covered up by the housing development, that is not exposed. And, you know, this and other work is really a jumping off point for many more projects to be done, because the connection of the AME Church with the Underground Railroad and its ties to us here locally is something that needs to be worked on and explored more. Dr. Emily Ant has worked on this a bit, and but there's more work to be done in regards to exploring those connections to the Underground Railroad.
I'll put a plug in here. So our next exhibition, actually opening September 24th with a nice free Meet the Artist reception on Sunday, September 25th at 2 o'clock, is Joseph Holston, a contemporary Maryland artist who has created a series of paintings that imagine a journey on the Underground Railroad. And we have Dr. Ampt speaking on October 1st at, I think, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And while I can't remember what the official title of the talk is, because she said, you know, there were the Underground Railroad is a very general term, and that there were all sorts of people involved in innovative ways of trying to get people to freedom. And so she hesitates to label everything Underground Railroad, but she is going to be giving a talk and a sort of imaginary journey for us on October 1st. So that's something to look forward to, and to tell some more of these stories in greater detail. We did have, and I think both of you will be good at addressing this. We had one person ask, you know, what happened to the economic prosperity of Jonathan Street? What did we do that isolated, cut off, and you know, drained the prosperity?
You know, it's a really complex issue in regard to what happened. But as we got to the period of time of the Civil Rights Movement, the Fair Housing Act and things of that nature, when African Americans could then start to leave the Jonathan Street community, from everything that I've seen, the community start to lose its power base. If you look at the early 1900s, there was roughly about 15 businesses in the Jonathan Street community. Around the height of the Civil Rights Act, there was roughly about 60 businesses. And then today there's 0. But along with losing the power base, when you get to the cities, you look at the crack cocaine epidemic and how that ravaged that community and how that was policed and other items. And with the community really becoming one where you have such low home ownership, and also a low voter base, the political power that community had established was being diminished. So its voice was not being heard. And I know with Terrence being from New York City, he probably has a different perspective on it than I do, but that's how I've seen it from the process that we have been in thus far.
No, absolutely. I think that Reconstruction as a whole was forced across the country, where communities like the historic Jonathan Street community that was littered with businesses, there was an increase of racism and violence that came with the Black codes that shifted and regressed the progression of African-American communities during that time as well. And I'm sure the historic Jonathan Street wasn't exempt from that. And as Reggie said, there was some prosperity that actually built in that, as well as you can see, I believe, look back in like 1870s, there was organizations like the Black Oddfellows organization, which was 1878 and 1875. There were organizations of predominant African-American business owners who would gather together and work on prosperity and build each other up and support one another. And as some of those lodges and things that united communities kind of also fractured, as well as the attendance of churches, which was another centralized location for Black communities. You've seen some of that fracture that spread into the communities as well. So I think, as Reggie stated, there was a lot of influence there. And also, as we look at businesses, we talk about it today still about access to capital and funding. And this was one of those communities that was also redlined, where funding for home ownership and starting businesses or sustaining businesses, they weren't getting into capital or funding to truly keep these businesses ongoing. So I think historically, there were a lot of things that were changing throughout our nation that this community was just a microcosm of and suffered some of the same ills.
Sorry, Daniel, you could show the map. I think, the red line, right, is at the point where the name changes from Summit to Jonathan Street, which you can see, if you're looking at the map that we have in the galleries there. And we had a couple more questions in the chat. I'm not sure if any of us know enough about Civil War here to be able to answer how the Confederates treated the community during the time they were ransacking Hagerstown after coming south from Gettysburg. Anybody have any insights into that? I'm sure we will get insights into that when we talk to Dr. Amt in October.
I do not have any specific insights into that, but one fascinating thing about that period of time, you had free and enslaved
very interesting
African Americans living amongst each other.
Yes, in my limited knowledge, in my limited knowledge, I imagined always that if you were enslaved, you were there on the property with the person that was enslaving you. And so when I started reading the history and realized that, that people could live off-site and would, commute to work, so to speak, that was a revelation to me. Yeah, that mixed community. Very interesting. So when did the shift come? I think it was, happening through the Civil War and after, when the shift came so that Jonathan Street became predominantly Black. Is that right? That's one of the questions in the chat as well.
Yes.
Yes, and Reggie, that's very interesting when you mentioned about the mixing of the different races, because we read about in the Hagerstown paper, particularly the Torchlight, weddings and other social gatherings in which Blacks and whites are getting together, and particularly between 1870s and 1890s, and many notices and short articles that reporters wrote up at the time. So again, that's part of all of these stories, so many to be told from this period about the neighborhood.
Well, and looking at the Moxley band and that family, even within families, you had free and enslaved living with each other. When you think of the Moxley band and the three brothers four of that band, one was free and two were enslaved. So within that community, there was a period of time that African Americans were living among German immigrants within the community, and then towards the late 1800s is when it started to move towards complete African-American ownership.
Yes, and here on the timelines, Annie Bentley, 1882, when she becomes the owner of what was then 415 Jonathan Street.
So why don't you bring up the picture of the pawn shop again, since we have somebody asking about
Sure.
that.
Yes, this is one of our main photographic displays in the exhibition. It's Wilson and Charles Barnum's pawn shop from probably the 1920s, from Maryland State Archives photographic collection. And there they are together. Where Wilson.
Great, and in the exhibition, they're life-size, I believe.
Yes.
Really wonderful to see them.
This was one of the first Black pawn shops in the entire state, independently owned and operating, and right in Hagerstown. Very interesting story.
Mm-hmm. And I would not venture to guess, how often people pawn shoes, or what circumstances led to it, or maybe they were old shoes, who knows? But the question was, did people really pawn shoes? Clearly they have a large display of shoes.
And there are many other stories within there, including June 23rd, 1950, coming up much later, when Willie Mays visited Hagerstown, and we believed he stayed at the Harmon Hotel, even though it unfortunately had suffered a fire some months earlier. It's also really a great story at that time, playing for the Trenton Giants, a farm team against the Boston Braves, also a farm team. Of course, he would go on to have an amazing career as a baseball player. So there are just many different, in doing the research for this exhibition, and just always finding intriguing stories and anecdotes, but of great importance as well.
So we are getting close on an hour. If anybody who's listening has any other particular questions, we'd love to hear them and answer them. Daniel, we could go back into the galleries a little bit. You can see the timeline. This is part of the exhibition, and the top of it is the story of the cabin, and the bottom of the timeline is Black history. And then in the cabin, you have another map of the neighborhood. I think it's a circa 1910, 1914 map, something like that.
Yes.
The artifacts, which are, generally very small. So, it really is sort of piecing together a story of these particular lives, but they're also really part of this bigger tale of the neighborhood. And I think we started out perhaps assuming too much knowledge on behalf of our listeners. That the cabin itself was a completely serendipitous discovery, and that it was part of an accident. It was crashed into by a police car, and when they were getting ready to demolish it, they discovered that in fact it was a very significant structure. So question in the Q&A, where do the things in the exhibit go from here? They will go back to the State Archaeological Repository down in Southern Maryland, which is at the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. A really, really interesting place. We had our visit there in December. That's Kelly Mealy, our Director of Education, and Daniel and myself, and Keelan Gant, who was our contemporary artist. And we, got a firsthand look at the many boxes and bags of artifacts, and talked about the things that revealed what we thought were significant things. The idea of prosperity in terms of the foodstuffs, the idea, we didn't talk about the slate pencil. That's another one of the really moving and important artifacts. Down there in the lower left corner, a really unassuming object, but it indicates literacy, that there's teaching, reading and writing happening in the cabin. You know, these traces of other people that are so evocative.
Yes, fragments of soda bottles letting us know what they drank, including strawberry soda, a popular beverage through the early 1900s. And then a series of pieces connected with warding off evil and bringing people good luck, such as Hoyt's German cologne. Or fragment of pretty decently preserved one of the bottle here. Here's the Hoyt's, originally founded in Philadelphia. And also,
you can still buy it. If you feel like you need a dose of luck, you can still buy some Hoyt's. Yeah, that was a really interesting conversation too, because culturally, it's a really common thing to find talismanic objects, things that are meant to protect the inhabitants or the wearer. They just vary, you know, the types of objects vary from culture to culture, but the horseshoe is one that's pretty ubiquitous. I mean, I grew up with a horseshoe over our kitchen door. So that one is kind of, you know, well known. The pierced disc is one that is really associated with, you know, Black Americans. I think it's something that, what can you tell us, Reggie and Tereance, what you know about the history of the pierced disc? Or Tereance, you're the only one now.
Yeah, in some research, we found out that it was used a token of spirituality. It was something that individuals would rub to ward off evil. And as you can see, this was rubbed pretty smooth. And a hole was placed in it, so most likely was worn around the neck of an individual or on a bracelet, someone who would rub it to ward off evil spirits and wish on good luck and prosperity.
So is that a practice that was brought probably from African culture?
Absolutely, yes. So it is one that I can't speak to exactly. Yeah, I think we've generalized it often as voodoo, but there was several different aspects of spirituality and religious behaviors that came from Africa and the West Indies as well.
So we have somebody who wants to see the picture of the children in front of the school again. So Daniel, you can look through that, and I will answer the question, and certainly Tereance and Reggie add to it if my answer is incomplete, but it's why is the cabin being placed on the market as opposed to being preserved? You know, there was a lot of community conversation about this. It's very small. It would require a lot of intervention and alteration to be made into a public site or a public museum, which would really change the character. It is on a residential street, you know, with neighbors close by. And so the preservation philosophy was to return it to single family ownership, which was its history for, you know, a long, long time. I know that there are easements on the property, and whoever buys it, you know, has to take really good care of it and respect its history. Do you have anything else to add to that answer, Tereance and Reggie?
Yeah, I would add quickly, absolutely everything you said. The size wasn't conducive to it being preserved. And especially with, you know, the efforts with the Dome Black History Museum going up right down the street from it as well. So there's some opportunity to celebrate the history with that project. But this piece of property, honestly, it feels like it should stay a home. That's where it started. It was one of the first homes purchased by African-American woman, so someone can live in it. Mr. Davis lived in it for generations and built his family as well. And to know that a family can go into this home and continue that tradition of community and being in this home just seems fitting for this project. But there are logistics and structural hindrances that doesn't afford it to be a museum, a standalone museum of its own.
Right, absolutely. So this has been, anybody have any final comments they want to make? We got a nice thank you in the Q&A, and I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. Obviously, every time we get together, it seems like we could follow veins into deeper directions, and I'm really happy that in some ways our next exhibition, the Joseph Holston exhibition, allows us to continue exposing some of these histories and also hopefully connecting to new audiences that we've developed. I cannot tell you how much joy we got from opening the museum up to people who had never been in the museum before, and to feeling you know, just the pleasure of people seeing their own stories reflected in the museum. It's been remarkably moving for all of us and professionally gratifying. So I will say that. If nobody else has anything else to add, I'm just going to have a couple announcements before we say goodnight. A reminder that that next exhibition, the Joseph Holston Color and Freedom Journey on the Underground Railroad, opens to the public September 24th with a opening reception on the 25th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You can go to our website and see some of the programs that we have lined up for that. And for those of you interested in our annual treasure sale, we are still accepting donations for the treasure sale, and it will be in person again at the museum in November next year. And our next Let's Talk Art will be in October and be very different, because we're going to be talking about mainly European prints from the pages of Pan, 1895 to 1900, another exhibition that we have opening in early October. So it's been really nice to be with all of you online tonight. And thank you so much, Terrence and Reggie, for once again helping us out.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.